Hello, welcome back. So today we're talking about care ethics, which is a broadly feminist approach to ethics. Um, you could treat it, I suppose, as a standalone theory, or you could treat it as a supplement to whatever your favorite theory is. Say, look, here's some insights that we should definitely incorporate to our favorite ethical theory. So this approach is typically attributed to Carol Gilligan, who is sets it up in response to a sort of traditional approach that she uses, particularly studied by a psychologist, Lawrence Kohlberg, to illustrate the difference. So we'll walk through those, um, both Kohlberg's study and Gilligan's. But to begin, I think it's important to frame it sort of because we are talking about gender and gender differences when it comes to ethical decision making and ethical theories. And you can't talk about that without some historical baggage coming along. So you may or may not be familiar with what's typically called the different waves of feminism. So first wave was like the suffrage movement in the 20s, where women got the right to vote. Then you had second wave feminism in the 70s, and then third wave feminism is more like the 90s, where you get more gender critical stuff, where you get the idea of gender, the distinction between gender and sex, and gender existing on a continuum where there's non-binary um, uh, on that continuum. So we're in the 70s area, thinking about the 70s era of feminism. Uh, there was a lot of instinctive reaction against the notion that men and women are different because traditionally differences between men and women had been used uh, to belittle women, right? So, if there's a traditional view that, oh, men are rational and women are emotional, right? Or men are, more suited to go out and work and earn money, and women are more suited to care for children in the home, right? And so on. In the 70s, broadly feminists said, hey, all that stuff isn't actually true, right? That's just social conditioning, right? And it's used for a purpose, which is to, keep women uh, oppressed and unable to, pursue their own interests. So frequently a feature of the feminism of the 60s and 70s was to deny any differences between gender. Men and women are exactly equal, exactly the same in every way. Anything a man can do, a woman can do. Right? And if there are sort of, statistical differences that we observe, because some facts are sort of undeniable, they say, well, that's the result of social conditioning. And, it's a consistent position you can hold. Some people, you may hold it today. Um, but that sort of view has sort of softened in the intervening years. And I think if you talk to most feminists these days, they would be open to the possibility that there are real gender differences, so long as we don't, use those to then say that, right, the feminine version of anything is inferior, right? As long as they're equal, they can be different. Um, at least that's a view some people have. You don't have to have it, right? Um, but we're going to be talking about, an approach, a feminist approach that does posit that there are actual differences between the way men and women approach it. We have to sort of clear that ground. It's a controversial subject in it. Um, and you might even say, right, and Carol Gilligan will say, if there are differences between men and women, it's not only the case that, the female version doesn't have to be worse, right? It can be equal. It could even be better, right? Um, and that's what you'll say is maybe, there's a feminist or a women's approach. Um, these are all loaded terms too, right? So this female often refers to sex, whereas woman refers to gender, right? And uh, it's not super important to this discussion, I don't think. Although if you have any takes on that from a more current sort of theoretical standpoint, feel free to throw it in the discussion. If I sometimes say female, sometimes say woman, for these purposes, yeah, they may be sort of interchangeable, though in other contexts they may not. But anyway, the idea is that yeah, maybe women are actually um, thinking about ethics in a superior way to men, right? So that Carol Gilligan wants to open that possibility. So she's critiquing Lawrence Kohlberg, who's I don't know, several decades earlier. he's just a psychologist. He's studying, child development, and he's doing a study about moral development in children. So he observes this. He's a little old-fashioned. I've sometimes have students sort of, particularly ones who have, experience in experimental psychology, more current. They might say this seems his study seems a little fluffy, not super rigorous, and that may be the case if you know like Piaget, right? He also did some studies where he just kind of observed his children and reported on what he saw. Sometimes people call that qualitative research as opposed to quantitative. So this may be a little qualitative, um, and maybe not as rigorous as you prefer. But at any rate, he observed a lot of different children. He gave them sort of questionnaires, um, cooked up little sort of scenarios, and asked them their opinions on what the right thing would be to do, and so on. And after observing, groups of children for some time, he formulated 6 stages that he thought that children advance through in terms of their moral development. So stage one is obeying authority and avoiding punishment. Right? So this is just, it's hardly morality, right? It's almost the same thing that like a psychopath can do, or Jeffrey Dahmer, right? They understand, okay, if I do this thing, I'll get punished or put in jail or whatever. Um, so I guess I shouldn't do it, but they have no sense that, right, it's just do it because it's wrong, right? They're not doing it because they don't want. Stage two is a little bit more developed in that it requires a theory of mind. So this is something that children get around age 4, right? Before age 4, sort of surprisingly, they don't really have the concept that someone else could have like a false belief, right? You can give them little scenarios and tell them like, you know, give them a puppet and say, here, I'm putting the cookie in the cookie jar. Now the puppet turns his back. I'm going to go hide the cookie in the cupboard. Where's the puppet going to go look for it? And they have no sense that the puppet has a false belief that it's in the cookie jar, and they'll say, "Oh, he'll go look in the cupboard because that's where it is. It's in the cupboard, right?" So this is kind of a advanced thing that comes online around age 4, where they realize, "Oh, other people have things going on in their heads," right? Um, and when you have that idea, then you can have the idea that other people have desires that they want to satisfy, and you can do trades, right? So okay, I want this toy, but my friend also wants this toy too, so maybe we can work it out so we each use the toy, part of the time, something like that. So that's a development uh, above just responding to punishment, right? Stage three, cultivating one's relationships and performing the duties appropriate to one's social roles. So this is important. So, I have a 5-year-old, right? And I was told by sort of specialists when I was a kid, we had chores around the house and we were paid for the chores, right? Okay, you sweep the yard, right? You clean up the leaves in the yard and you get $1 or whatever. And I was told by sort of experts in the field, oh, actually, you shouldn't do that, right? Um, you should let your child know that just as being a part of the family, you have certain jobs and you just do them, right? And so it's kind of advancing from stage 2, where you're doing fair trades, to stage 3, where it's just, okay, you have a role, right? You have a job to do in this group and you just do it, right? So that's stage 3. Then they progress to stage 4, where they can sort of think about larger groups like obeying the law, right? So this is not just a family thing, but now all of a sudden we understand that we steal from people even if they're not in our, we don't steal from people even if they're not in our family, right? It's a broader idea of your moral circle, which then expands in stage 5 to sort of all of humanity, right? So all people have certain basic rights, and you just can't harm people, period, right? Without their, that we have people have rights to privacy, bodily integrity, and so on. And then finally, stage 6, they become little philosophers and they're able to formulate abstract universal moral principles. Right? So he saw all that, right? And, these are children from, very young, obviously, up through, I mean, the examples here we have with children like age 11, age 9, stuff like that. So here's one example of one of the scenarios that Kohlberg would give the children, right? So this is about a fellow named Heinz. He says, "Look, there's a guy named Heinz, and he's married, and his wife is almost near death. Right? She's got a terrible disease. Her only hope is a new drug that was discovered by a pharmacist, but the pharmacist is selling it for a very high price. The drug only costs $200 to make, but the pharmacist is selling it for $2,000. And Heinz tries to scrape together as much money as he can. He can only raise $1,000. He asks the pharmacist, "Hey, can I pay you half now and pay the rest off in installments. The pharmacist says, sorry, I need full payment right now. Um, and so Hines is pretty desperate, and he's wondering if maybe he will just break into the pharmacy at night and steal the drug, right? So he asks the child, would that be wrong? So here's one response from an 11-year-old named Jake. Obviously, there were more than two children involved in this study, right? But these are just two examples. Uh, so Jake says, yeah, Hines should steal the drug, right? And when Kohlberg asks uh, Jake, well, why? Why should Hines steal the drug? Jake says this. Well, for one thing, a human life is worth more than money. And if the druggist only makes $1,000, he's still going to live. But if Hines doesn't steal the drug, his wife is going to die. And then Kohlberg asks uh, Jake, well, why is life worth more than money? Well, because the druggist can get $1,000 later from rich people with cancer, but Hines can't get his wife again. Well, why not? Why can't Hines get his wife again? Well, because people are all different, so you couldn't get Hines' wife again. So hopefully this sounds very familiar to you. Um, Kant's second version of the categorical imperative, right, which is based on the idea that human beings are special, right, and should always be treated as ends in themselves, never merely as means. And part of his reasoning for that, of Kant's reasoning for what's special about humans, is that they are irreplaceable, right? So Heinz can't get his wife again, right? If a child dies, you can have another child, but you can't replace that child, right? Which is why we're still sad, even if you have another child, and if one dies, um, so on. So Jake is pretty Kantian here, right? And he's making some universal moral claims, right? Human life is worth more than money, and so on. So Kohlberg is going to place Jake pretty high, right, on the stages of development. He's on stage 6 here. He's making some universal moral claims. Now here's Amy, a girl, also 11, right? Now these pictures aren't of the actual people. I just found pictures of an 11-year-old boy and 11-year-old girl. So Amy is told the whole scenario and asks, should Hines steal the drug? And Amy says, well, I don't think so. I think there might be other ways besides stealing it. Like if he could borrow the money or make a loan or something, but he really shouldn't steal the drug. But his wife shouldn't die either. If he stole the drug, he might save his wife then, but if he did, then he might have to go to jail. And then his wife might get sicker again, and he couldn't get more of the drug, and it might not be good. So they should really just talk it out and find some other way to make the money. So Amy's response, very different, right? A child of the same age as Jake. Uh, I don't see any universal moral principles being cited, right? She, in a way, kind of refuses to play the game, right? So even though, Kohlberg stipulates that the pharmacist will not make a deal, she says, well, come on, there's got to be a way to make a deal here, right? And importantly, she points out that, by stealing the drug, Hines might get caught and might go to jail, and then he's not going to be able to help his wife at all in that case, right? So there seems to be a focus on uh, people's social roles, their relationships, and on the very specific context and the idea that there must be a way to work this out where everyone is satisfied, right? Instead of just sort of unilaterally saying, pharmacist, you have violated, right, my universal principle, and therefore I can steal from you, right? She wants to say, look, everyone can be made happy here, and importantly, Hines needs to take his role as husband seriously and not just do some stupid thing like steal a drug and then get sent to jail, not fulfilling his husband role. So this focus on social roles looks very much like stage 3. So this is, what I've been saying here, right? So personal relationships seem to be guiding it, right? That we've got humans, right, that should be able to work these things out. The husband needs to do what right for his wife. He should be able to talk to the pharmacist. The pharmacist is human too. She's not a monster, hopefully. She should be able to work something out, right? So Amy gets placed at stage 3. Jake, who's making the universal moral claims, is placed at stage 6. Right? And Kohlberg notices these differences between boys and girls and notes it, right? And according to Kohlberg, that means that boys advance to higher stages of moral reasoning more quickly, right? But Carol Gilligan looks back at this study and sees something different going on, right? Um, Clearly, Jake and Amy are obviously approaching the question differently, but she wants to challenge the idea that Jake's is superior, right? Or that he's at a more advanced stage, right? Instead, Gilligan says maybe what's going on here is we have genuine gender differences in the way we approach ethical questions, but maybe one is not superior to the other, or at any rate, clearly it's not clear that Jake's approach is superior, right? Um, and she says, in fact, if you look back, right, at John Stuart Mill and Kant and all these men in the history of ethics and philosophy, um, they do have this tendency to want to make these universal, general algorithms for doing the right thing. Um, and, for various historical reasons, sexism included, there haven't been as many female philosophers, right, of that stature and she says, if we had, maybe we would have two different approaches, right? It has seemed as if this universal algorithms for moral choices has been the only way to do it, but maybe that's because women have not been listened to adequately, right? Men, she says, want to abstract away the details, right? Make the situation conform to some general principle, whereas women um, focus on the details, right? Refuse to ignore them, and every decision ends up being very context sensitive, right? And and sensitive to relationships among humans, right? Like Amy worries that if Heinz stole the drug, he might go to jail, which would be worse for his family. Jake doesn't even think of that. Right? So Gilligan develops a general approach to ethics. It's, again, having approached all ethics, from kind of historically, more or less. We've covered a lot of these sort of male, general, abstract, algorithmic approaches. So now switching gears fairly quickly is going to make it almost seem this like, is this even a theory, right? But I encourage you to sort of like soften up your preconceptions about what a theory of ethics should look like, right? Um, so there's not exactly an answer to the right thing to do in situation X is this right here, whereas utilitarianism can give you an answer and Kant has this categorical imperative that will generate an answer. But we have a general characterization of the approach, which is taking into consideration other people's perspectives. Right? So Amy refused to discount the pharmacist's point of view, even though the pharmacist seemed to be, a bit of a jerk at least, right? Possibly a moral monster, right? That making this drug very cheaply, refusing to sell it to a dying person, even though they would have still made money. Um, Amy says, no, even so, this is a human being. We take their perspective into account, right? Um, so here is a characterization of ethics by another writer, Virginia Held. And she says the care ethics, the approach is the central idea is caring, empathy, feeling with others, being sensitive to each other's feelings. All may be better guides to what morality requires in actual contexts than maybe abstract rules of reason or rational calculation, or at least they may be necessary components of an adequate morality, right? So it's possible to interpret this not as a standalone theory of ethics, but to say, hey, this is something necessary that has been left out, right? Which is every moral decision um, is a very specific decision with lots of details that aren't going to be covered by a universal principle. Um, and those need to be paid attention to, and in particular, right, the perspectives of others, empathy for others need to be thought of. And when you focus on all those factors, you'll end up making the right decision. So, an interesting new novel approach, right? I've had people at this point in the class be like, to them, this seems like the right approach, and they wonder why it took the whole class to get to it. Well, it's a relatively recent one, right? Um, so, at any rate, it's interesting, right? Merits further consideration. One important question is, well, is it true, right? Are there differences between men and women? We've only so far discussed this one uh, uh, developmental study, right? Maybe these are just differences at age 11, right? What happens into adulthood? Are there genuine empirical differences between the way men and women approach morality? Uh, well, it is an empirical question, so we can study it scientifically. There is some research on the matter, so you can give people surveys, empathy tests, which basically just, you ask them various questions and they give some sort of response. And you can sort of test how empathetic they are. Um, Women tend to score better on empathy tests. Uh, you can put people in an MRI machine that measures blood flow to certain areas of the brain, which is indicative of like that area of the brain being more active. And we know generally which areas of the brain are responsible for which uh, various things. And so the areas of the brain that are responsible for pleasure seem to be more active in men when they see people being punished and less active in women, which seems to think that also indicate empathy, right? That they're able to take the perspective of the person being punished and therefore find it less pleasurable. So, just a couple. It's a ripe area for study if you want to. Uh, right? Again, it's not too late to change a paper topic if you all of a sudden, oh, this is very interesting to me, and now I have a great idea. Yeah, go for it. And um, there's lots of territory there to the empirical research if there's any more recent stuff. But we should also say, even if there are genuine differences, they can't be there's a limit to how extreme they must be, right? Because uh, men and women don't make, for example, different judgments on whether murder is wrong, right? You ask men, hey, were the Nazis bad? Yes, women were the Nazis bad. People will typically say, yes, they were bad, right? There's broad agreement on moral issues. That's, something we've been relying on throughout this class with all these thought experiments, right? We assume that when I give you a trolley problem, pull the lever, right, to kill your mom or save five people, I assume everyone's going to have more or less the same response, right? Because even though, about half of you are women and half of you are men, um, because we assume that, men and women are largely similar in their moral judgment. And it's not as though men can't understand compromise or personal relationships or empathy or anything like that. And, if I go up on the street and ask a woman, hey, do you think that human life is worth more than money? They're likely to say yes, right? So the differences, if there are differences, and there probably aren't huge, right? Um, and of course, there's going to be overlap. So overlap. Some women may be very Kantian in the way they think about morality, and some men may be very empathetic, right? Uh, but it could be true, right? There could be differences, to some degree. Of course, even if we establish there's differences, then there's the question of, well, are they biological, right, or are they social? Um, you know, it very much could be a social phenomenon, right? So you can imagine, right, if traditionally uh, women have largely done most of the child care and caring for a child requires being empathetic, particularly with a baby they can't speak and tell you what they want, right? Um, then yeah, you could see why um, right? Empathy, right? And close relationships might seem more important to women than to men who are out there trying to, whatever, sell cars to strangers or whatever men have traditionally done. But there could be genetic differences as well. Just one bit of evidence. It seems like newborn girls are more interested in looking at faces than newborn boys, right? So that may be a indication of more empathy in women even before they've had time to be socialized, right? It's possible. So, having at least pointed out that there may be another approach, this a broadly feminine approach to ethics, and roughly characterized it, um, that at least gives us enough information to sort of test it against the other theories and see if it's got anything going for it. And it does seem to have at least a couple things going for it. So, first of all, there was this problem of utilitarianism being very demanding, and one of the ways it's very demanding is it didn't seem to leave room for partiality, right? For treating your children or your parents or your close friends any better than a stranger on the other side of the world, right? Because again, for utilitarians, everyone's pain and pleasure counts equally. Um, but we want to say, look, I can make moral decisions that favor, people that are close to me, right? It seems like no one should be required to pull the lever in the trolley problem and kill their mom to save five. That seems crazy to most of us, right? Well, care ethics can make sense of this, right? Because it's all about, your particular relationships in particular contexts. So, um, a care ethicist may say, sure, you do have like some sort of relationship to a stranger on the other side of the world, right? And as, you know, a member of the human race, then you have some obligation to them, but it's going to be very, very different than your obligation to your, your wife in the Heinz case, right? And so, of course, you have feel a stronger ethical duty. You have a much closer relationship, right? A much stronger empathetic connection. And so, feminist ethics would give us the answer that yes, of course, you would favor your wife or your mom. And it also makes sense of sort of the latte situation, that demandingness of utilitarianism. I can't ever spend any money on myself if I could save a starving child somewhere. And again, care ethics says, look, you have some sort of relationship with a starving person on the other side of the world, but like not much of one, right? Because for them, if morality is all tied up with empathy and relationships, it's much more going to favor, relationships where you see the person, right? And you have daily duties toward them and things like that. It's going to be much more focused on closer relationships. It also makes sense. So utilitarianism, right? At least, according to Peter Singer, entails that we shouldn't eat animals, right? Because hey, they can feel pleasure, they can feel pain. Um, why would I kill a pig when I could eat an eggplant instead and have almost as much pleasure than I would have from the bacon, right? Care ethics can make sense of why many of us are still not vegetarians, right? Well, we're much closer to other humans. That's why we treat humans differently than animals, right? Why we don't count animal pain as the same as human pain. We just aren't as close. We don't have the same kind of relationship with animals, right? But interestingly, some animals we do, right? We are very close to our dogs and our cats, right? Um, we are much more empathetic with them. And that makes sense of why most of us would not eat a dog or a cat, but we might eat a pig, right? Most of us just don't have a close relationship with any pigs, right? Now, one possible counterexample to this would be farmers, right? For most of human history, most of us were farming and most of us were keeping animals close to the house and then eating those animals, right? So I don't know if any of you had a chicken that you raised and then killed and ate. Humans have been doing that for actually a larger part of human history, right? And they don't seem, even though they're very close to those animals, they don't seem to have any trouble eating them. So I'm not sure how the care ethicists would respond to that. Last point. So yeah, we do want to make sense of our intuitions, but there's always the caveat that like intuitions, they can be fuzzy, right? They can't always be trusted because, if we look back into history, our intuitions were often immoral, right? So again, like if we were taking this class 100 years ago, well, it wouldn't be online, it would be in person. But also, if I asked you folks questions about, interracial marriage 100 years ago, a larger proportion of you would have been like, no, that's wrong, that's horribly wrong, right? Your gut would be telling you it's wrong. Well, that was just, people had immoral views about race back then, right? And that influenced their intuition. So it's always hard to say whether, it's great if a theory matches our intuitions. Hopefully those are the good ones and not the evil ones that we'll realize 200 years later that they were evil intuitions, right? Um, at any rate, so I hope some of you find that interesting, and we'll be wrapping up the Rachel's text in the next lecture, and then for the final part of the class, we'll be moving on to some readings that I've posted, uh, Moodle, that are about political philosophy, I guess broadly, but like distributive justice. What is the right way to run a society, and how do we distribute the goods and the money in the society in a fair way? All right, I will see you next time.